This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Spyderco Spydiechef. A very popular knife from a few years back. We're going to go through this knife in a relatively quick little review, go through the specifications, go through what I like or don't like about it, give it a score across a 10-point scale. Let's get right into it, because I think a lot of you already know this knife relatively well. The Spyderco Spydiechef is one of Spyderco's collaborations with Marcin Swish, a relatively well-known custom maker. There's his maker's mark right there. Made in Taichung, Taiwan. This came out a few years back, and as you would expect from the name, Spydiechef there. A couple of its distinguishing factors are its use of a highly corrosion-resistant steel in LC200N. Though you can see I have still managed to get a bit of schmutz on that blade. And then also the chef part is the way this blade and handle are designed with this big upswept, basically sheep's foot blade style here. And this handle, which allows you to get all four fingers on that handle and still get down sort of onto a cutting board or onto a flat surface and still have this entire blade surface, or most of it, to do sort of rocking cuts like you'd expect for a chef's knife. Let's go through some specifications. So the Spyderco Spydiechef is made in Spyderco's Taichung, Taiwan factory. This blade here is 3.32 inches long. It is 110 thousandths thick, so 0.11 inches, which is relatively thin. You can see it is a full flat grind here, but carries most of that thickness most of the way out to the tip. This entire, basically up until it bends here, it is full thickness, that full 110 thousandths. LC200N is, I talked about it in my Caribbean review, it is a steel that is extremely corrosion resistant. Not quite as corrosion resistant as MagnaCut, but before MagnaCut came out, it was sort of the big thing in corrosion resistant steels. Actually, it might be a little bit more than MagnaCut still. It is also a steel that is quite tough, but it doesn't have the greatest edge retention. Overall length of this knife is 7.78 inches. Weight is 3.78 ounces, and with most of Marcin Swish's designs, this pivot is on washers. Let's do some quick size comparisons. First size comparison here will be to the two other Marcin Swish designs I've got. There is your sway back. There is your Swish buoy. As I mentioned in the buoy review, you can see Marcin Swish tends to operate in a relatively narrow size range. The Techno is much smaller, but these three knives are all almost the exact same size in terms of overall length and even in terms of blade length and handle length independently. They're all in the slightly smaller end of what most people consider a full-size knife. Let's get a Sabenza out here. Here's your large Sabenza. And you can see it's just a little bit smaller in both the blade and the handle than your large Sabenza. If we get another Spyderco out here, here's your PM2. You can see very similar in size. Again, just a little bit smaller in the blade, a little bit smaller in the handle than your PM2. And then a couple Benchmade for Benchmade folks. There's your 940, and there is your Bug Out. And you can see just a little bit shorter than the 940, a little bit longer than the Bug Out. One of the most remarkable features of the Spydiechef, however, is not how it looks on this dimension, but how it looks on this dimension. So your Spydiechef here, the way it is designed, it's got, again, this 110 thousandths blade stock, which is thin by most company standards. It's on the thinner side, but not exceptionally thin by Spyderco standards. But then you have these quite thin, flat titanium scales, which look to me to be almost the exact same thickness as the blade. The result is that when folded up like this, the entire profile of the knife is quite thin. If you compare this to your 940, which is a relatively thin knife, you can see it is, and these are aftermarket scales, but they fit the profile and thickness of the stock scales, you can see it is quite a bit thinner even than the 940. Same deal, these are maybe a bit thinner than the stock scales, but similar. It is thinner, slightly, than the Bug Out. If I compare it to a PM2 here, you can see it is substantially thinner than a PM2. Compare it to a Sebenza, thinner than a Sebenza. This knife is extremely thin overall because of the way it is designed, because of this thin blade stock and these thin scales. So let's just go over what this knife has in general and start with the blade. This is an upswept sheep's foot blade. So if you took this tip and canted it down, this would be a very clear sort of sheep's foot, pretty traditional sheep's foot, but what they've done, what Swish has done here, Marcin Swish, is tilted the tip up so that you've got this big belly going all the way up here while still having that sort of dulled tip that you get with a sheep's foot. And in fact, that entire, if you really look at it in terms of where your hand sits, I mean, technically it's straight coming off the back of the knife. You can see when you sort of lay it down, if you were to lay this down on the table, this is straight across here. But in practice, because of the way the handle sort of cants your hand downward, it wants to come sort of down there, this ends up feeling like an upswept tip. It is all belly, all the way from the tip down to the base of the knife. And you can see again, with that sort of upswept design, depending on how you look at it, this tip is either even with the back of the scales or, again, in practice, feels like it's even a little bit above the back of the scales. It almost feels Persian-esque sometimes when you use it, without having that super pointy tip that Persian blades tend to have. Full flat grind with 110,000 stock with Tai Chung's grinds does mean that this tends to be a very slicey blade. This wants to cut, even with the factory edge. I've resharpened a lot of my Spydercos. This was one that I did not feel the need to resharpen because of how slicey this edge was right out of the box. Now, I will need to resharpen it with more use, just because LC200N is not the greatest steel in terms of edge holding, but this is a remarkably slicey blade, as you would expect from its design. Thin stock, big grind, lots of space to drop with a relatively aggressive grind, which you can see from the plunge there. This is quite thin behind the edge. Not super thin. They did keep it a little bit tough, a little bit more robust, but it is more than thin enough for virtually all the cutting tasks that you would need, including food prep, which you would expect with that Spydiechef name. In terms of use, it is notable that this is a folding knife because you can get it and, pretend that there's sort of a table here, because you can get this knife, the whole belly pretty much down on a table without your fingers running into the table. This is an unusually good folding knife for food prep. And that is a remarkable benefit from the Spydiechef if you are somebody who would want to use your folding knife for food prep. I consider that actually a little bit more of a niche use. The fact is, chef knives are really, really good at food prep. I have never really felt the need to use a folding knife for food prep, except as a gimmick or an excuse to use my folding knife more. If we look at this as a general use and an EDC knife, there still are some pretty significant benefits to this blade shape. You basically get a lot of the benefits of a sheep's foot and a lot of the benefits of a high tip all at once. With the high tip, it is very easy to get into and around your cuts. When I'm using this in the garden, part of the problem with Warncliffes and things that have the tip sort of down here is you have to cant your wrist all the way back sometimes to get into a cut. If what I want to cut is out here and my tip is, dropped, then rather than just sort of coming in very naturally without bending my wrist much, if my tip was dropped, I would have to bring my wrist all the way back to start the cut, which gets more awkward. Especially when you're working in tight spaces, it can be more difficult to get the knife where you want to be. By raising this tip, they have managed to sort of the Sebenza has a little bit of that, because the Sebenza does have a relatively high tip. With this high tip, it's very easy, whatever you're cutting, to get into the cut and start that cut. You very much get that with the Spydiechef, and I felt that particularly in the garden, if I was trying to trim, prune, things like that, it was very easy to get this tip exactly where I needed to and start those cuts. Whether I was holding something, whether I was, cutting down on something, dragging through something. And at the same time, with that sheep's foot design, even though the tip is high, the way that this handle cants, and we'll talk about the handle in a second, and the way that it's all belly up to that tip, it is still relatively easy to get to that tip and drag it down for your pull cuts, for things like opening boxes where you want to score a surface. It really does end up being a blade design that is a little bit of the best of all worlds. You get the precision toward and around the tip that you tend to get with a sheep's foot. You also get the safety factor that you tend to get with a sheep's foot, because part of the reason that sheep's feet sort of dull this tip is because you get a less stabby, less pokey tip, which can be a safety feature when you're, working around your own hand, working around things that you might not want to puncture. Again, niche use case, but it is there. But with this big old belly, it's very easy to stay in a cut, whether you're cutting through cardboard and cutting down. It just continues slicing very easily and naturally. Whether you're cutting through, plant material, whether you're doing, stuff around the house, drywall, cutting through twine, all that sort of stuff. This ends up being a very naturally useful blade shape, because it does give you lots of belly. It gives you a highly accessible tip that is still high enough to be get into cuts easily. And because of that big old drop and that thin stock, it also slices very well. The blade is almost entirely corrosion resistant, which is a big plus. And it is relatively tough, which means that you can push this blade pretty hard without worrying about rolling or chipping. The only downside, really, of this blade shape is that LC200N, again, is not the best steel in the world in terms of edge retention. If they were to make a Spydiechef 2.0 and substitute MagnaCut for that LC200N, there would be virtually nothing to complain about with this blade shape. It is just a really, really functional and impressive blade design, independent of the fact that it can also be used for food prep. It just ends up being a great utilitarian blade shape. And then we go into the handle, which to me is actually designed even more impressively than the blade shape. So, as typical with Marcin Swish, the handle design is quite a bit weird. It's this sort of crescent shape with, honestly, a pretty simple undercarriage. You've got a finger guard here, and then this is really just a big old belly. There is a nice little scallop here to access the lock bar. This is a frame lock, and with this frame lock, there tends to be a lock stick when you get a fresh Spydiechef, but it will wear itself away over time. And it is relatively light lock bar tension. You'll hear still a little bit of stick and scrape, just a little bit, but that does wear itself away. It's plenty secure, never had any lock failures, anything like that, and this is a nice little secure scallop to access that big old curve on the bottom here. And then on the back here, you've got sort of Marcin Swish's, this, at least it's shared between the buoy and the chef, the way he does this angle down here. That's just purely visual, but it gives you a cool little cutout, shows you a little bit of blade across the back there. And the blade merges seamlessly into the back line of the handle. There's a rounded kink here, a little bit of very subtle rounding going into a more angular butt. And then this sort of chamfer here, which does help with pinch grips. That's the other nice thing about the blade, is you can pinch it and it works very well. That edge is very accessible for those sort of precision cuts, using it like a paring knife. This handle doesn't necessarily look comfortable, especially when you consider the fact that it is thin slab-sided titanium scales with some chamfers, but they are thin and slab-sided. But in the hand, it ends up working very, very well. This is a generous finger guard, and your front fingers do feel very secure here. This kink here, the way this is designed, is really part of the reason the knife works so well. It just rolls into the palm very naturally, very easily. And with the flats here, with this chamfer all the way around the edge being large enough that these don't feel blocky, this is quite comfortable in the hand in a way that a lot of thin knives are not. Even when you push this, this tends to be a very comfortable knife in your palm. It just rides quite neatly in the center of your palm there. Fingers have plenty of space. Even if you have larger hands than me, this is secure. This front finger guard is doing a lot of the work, keeping it secure. There's no jimping anywhere. But this is a very well-designed handle for this grip when you're pushing, when you're, dragging, pulling, things like that. But again, you can put your middle finger up in this guard and very easily get up on this blade for your detail cuts, where you're using it more like a chef's knife, where you're kind of holding the blade. Really nicely designed, intuitively ergonomic handle. In Marcin Swish's sort of typical blasted titanium finish. It picks up snail trails in a way that I find very pleasant, that looks very nice, especially around the edges. You get this nice sort of almost stonewash look around the edges as you use it. Blacked out hardware keeps this handle feeling kind of monochrome. I've got an aftermarket clip on here. That's the way I received it. It's a very nicely designed handle. And then you do have the benefit as well of it being super, super thin in the hand and most importantly in the pocket, which is a huge benefit in terms of carry. So just a really impressively designed knife. Shows Marcin Swish's design chops, and I think that's part of the reason that this design is probably the most popular of his designs for Spyderco. Because when you look at both the blade and the handle, it looks very cool, looks very distinct, but it has an enormous amount of utility. So with all that said, let's get to the scores here. And the Spyderco Spydiechef is a very high-scoring knife. This is, I believe, still one of, let's just nudge this back just a little bit. There we go. This is still one of the best everyday carry knives that I think, there we go. This is still, I think, one of the best everyday carry knives that you can buy, with the one caveat that the steel might not be something everybody likes and the price is getting a little high. So I rate knives on a 10-point scale. 5 are related to sort of how fun the knife is, how interesting it is, how cool the design is, and 5 are related to how functional it is, how useful it is. Each one I'm now grading on an A through F sort of GPA or school grade kind of scale, and then we roll it all up into total scores in each area. Starting with the fun factors, blade design is a solid A-. This blade design, in addition to being very cool, very aesthetic, very unusual, there is no other blade design that looks quite like the Spydiechef. It's also extremely useful, giving you a lot of the best of sort of a high clip point or even a straight back sort of design. I mean, if you were to chop this off, it would be basically a very slight drop point or even a straight back, while still giving you all the benefits of a sheep's foot and tons of belly. It just ends up being a design that is super distinctive and super useful, while making the smart choice to use a full flat grind with thin stock so it's slicey. There's a ton to like about this blade design. Frankly, it's, actually it is. This is a straight A in blade design. It just works really, really well. And in fact, I'm going to make this a flat A in handle design as well, for all the reasons that I mentioned in the, as I was looking at it. This handle design, it just works so much better in the hand than it looks. The chamfers are nicely done. The finish is really distinctive, really sort of just wears in very nicely. And this unintuitive looking handle shape, which looks sort of blocky, looks like it could be uncomfortable, ends up just working really, really well in the hand in a variety of grips, including a full 4-finger grip, a choked up grip, things like that. This back in particular rolls very nicely into your palm. Very easy, very intuitive to use. Action. Action is a B. So this is a Tai Chung frame lock on washers. It is smooth, very smooth. Every Spydiechef I've gotten has been a little gritty out of the box, but over time they do smooth into sort of that glassy, that oil on glass kind of washer action. It's not sublime like a Sebenza, but it is very controlled, very nice the whole way. There's no play whatsoever, very solid when it's open. The Spidey hole, as is typical for Tai Chung, is not really knocked down. It is relatively sharp, but there is plenty of Spidey hole access here. It's placed nicely relative to the pivot. I tend to slow roll my Spydiechef. I find that works best, but you can do a good old thumb flick if you want to, and then it will sort of shake shut. You could loosen up this pivot, lube it up a lot, and you can get it to drop shut, but right now it's sort of a relatively loose shake shut knife. It's a very satisfying action without being exceptional. And again, the lock release tends to be a little sticky at first, but once that stick goes away, easy to disengage that lock while it is still secure. B in action. Fit and finish. B, which is typical for Tai Chung Taiwan. This is not a complicated knife design. There's not a lot of complexity going on with these scales or with these blades, but everything is finished nicely. Those blade grinds are very nice, very even. Tai Chung does a very nice bell satin. Nice cut on the plunge there. There is a little bit of knocking down on the blade edges here. There's just sort of a little chamfer right there. There is a tiny bit of knocking down on that Spidey hole there. It's just a very small knockdown, so it keeps everything sort of sharp, intentionally so. Scales, very nice kind of bead blast finish here. Nice chamfer all the way around. Hardware is nicely flush. Everything is nicely sort of parallel, fits together very well. Your lock bar, it's a bit of a big cutout, but that's fine. There's your lock bar access there, and mine has always been nicely centered. Nothing that they're really trying to shoot the moon for here, but that's a solid B in fit and finish. And then the cool factor here, I'm calling it an A-. This is, on paper, there's nothing crazy unusual about this knife. It is a titanium bead blasted frame lock with a big old satin finish blade. But it is just still a very distinctive, very unique design that really doesn't look like anything else on the market. It's just, if you want a Spydiechef, there's nothing quite like the Spydiechef, and it's meaningfully differentiated in the fact that, Marcin Swish's design cues here do make it look kind of weird, kind of unusual, and kind of just cool. In a way that a lot of knives aren't necessarily. There's nothing that will wow you about this, but especially, I find that it looks particularly cool closed up. The way that this straight line all the way from the bottom of that finger guard goes right through the entire knife. The way this sort of knockout for the Spidey hole merges nicely into the scales, and the way the blade just sort of disappears toward the butt, it just looks quite cool. It's a very well thought out design that improves the cool factor quite a bit. A- there. So that is an A- overall in sort of the fun factor. This is a very fun knife. This is a very interesting knife. There's a lot of interesting design thought into this. It's an extremely well thought out knife from a design perspective. Which then brings us to function. Cutting performance is an A-. I've already talked plenty about how well this blade design cuts, both because the grind, thin stock, full flat grind leads to a very slicey edge, but then on top of that, this is just obscenely useful blade profile. The main reason that it's an A- and not higher is, one, it's not, there are some, if you want to do stabby sorts of cuts or, really precise tip work, that is the downside of a sheep's foot tip like this, so it does struggle with some of those. And the other problem is, if you start really using this as like an everyday carry, you will start to feel the limitations of the LC200N, and you will find yourself resharpening this more often than a lot of other knives you might be used to if you're used to S45VN, Magna Cut, things like that. I appreciate them going with the stainless option here, but because this is really sort of positioned a little bit as an EDC knife, that starts to feel a bit like a limitation. So A- there, which is still very solid. Utility, B. Between the blade shape and the handle shape, very natural in the hand, very natural to use for a lot of different cutting tasks. The challenge, the limitation here, which I didn't talk about because it's outside its intended use case, but this does not end up feeling like a true general use knife, because with this blade shape and with how thin these handle scales are, how thin the whole knife is, there is nothing about this knife that is a hard use knife, or nothing about this knife that feels like it, as you start to push it into harder use tasks, cutting up carpet, cutting through really tough plant material, your harder, heavier EDC tasks, it does start to feel limited. It does, this handle will start to get a little pointy when you start to really push it. This ends up being a knife that is restricted functionally to sort of lighter duty tasks. It excels at a great many of those, but just the nature of a thin handle like this and a thin blade, it's not going to be the greatest, and it does start to feel a little chunky when you push it into heavier duty tasks. But frankly, as an everyday EDC knife, it's a B, because you will encounter occasions where you wish you had a knife that was a little bit more rounded, a little bit chunkier, or just a little bit more ergonomic. If you're carrying this and trying to do everything with it, but you'll be very happy with this for most of your everyday tasks, whether those are, boxes and sort of around the house tasks, whether those are sort of, home improvement type tasks, or whether that's stuff in the garden, food prep, stuff like that. Very versatile, solid B. Feel, B+, again, that's sort of the interaction between the handle and the blade here, very, very natural. The way that this blade handle rolls into the palm, the way that this tip makes it very easy to get into, out of, and around cuts. This is a very natural knife in the hand, again, with the exception of those heavier duty cuts. It's really sort of one of those Spyderco knives, whether you're pinching up, whether you're holding back, that it just does what you want it to pretty much all the time. So B, very natural, very easy to use. Carry is a solid A. That is the benefit of this handle design being so thin. The way that this whole blade sits into the handle, it takes up not that much more space than the handle in the pocket. Even though this is a 3.5 ounce knife, it doesn't feel it because it is so skinny. This is a very easy knife to slip into and out of the pocket. It's a very easy knife to have other things in your pocket alongside it. Again, if you compare it even to a Sebenza, you can see it's bigger than the Sebenza in this way, but it's lighter, and the fact that it is so skinny makes it really, really easy to carry. And to that extent, if you're the sort of person that likes to carry two knives, this is an easy knife. It almost starts to feel like a backup knife in terms of carry profile, just because it is so thin and so skinny. Really great carry experience, easy to have on you every day. Solid A- there. It doesn't disappear in the pocket the way that some smaller knives do. It does still take up sort of a block of space, but it is much easier to carry than its weight and size would generally suggest. Value, unfortunately, is going to be a C+. This is a $303 knife these days, and $303 is a lot of money. You're getting a very well machined, very well manufactured, full titanium frame lock from Spyderco's Taichung factory with the level of fit and finish that implies. It's really nicely done. But looking at it, as a slicey, relatively versatile EDC knife, $303 is starting to push toward the upper end of what a lot of people want to pay for that sort of basic EDC knife, which is really where this excels. A versatile, basic, everyday carry knife that can do a lot of those lighter duty tasks. Is more expensive than a TRM Atom, much more expensive than something like a PM2 or a Bodacious or anything like that. There's nothing in the materials and design that makes $303 feel ridiculous, but this is a victim of Spyderco's progressive price creep, where this feels much more expensive than it used to. You also frankly see that on the secondary market. This is a $200 knife on the secondary market. So if you are somebody who plays on the secondary or likes to buy and resell your knives, you're going to take a bath if you buy this at retail. So that's a C+ in value, which brings us back to a function score of a B+ and an overall A-. This is a very good knife. This is a highly recommendable EDC knife. This is really up there with the TRM Atom. This is up there with, some of Demco's, the AD 20.5, stuff like that. I guess that one's also made in Taichung, as really, really good EDC options, really versatile EDC options still in 2024. This one has a little bit more style, a little bit more sort of going on from a visual perspective, a design perspective, than a lot of those other more basic EDC knives have. But still, it's an immaculately designed blade, a very cleverly designed handle that ends up having not just an unusual visual profile, but a few very unique functional benefits as well. This blade design, it's hard to overstate how clever this blade design is in function, and the handle supports it really nicely. And then of course that whole carry profile is unusually good even across the entire knife market. This is a highly recommendable knife. Pretty much the only downsides are the price and the fact that you are going to have to sharpen a little bit more often with that LC200N. But if you're wondering, does the Spydiechef still hold up in 2024? Absolutely. Is the Spydiechef a good, silly good EDC knife in 2024? Absolutely. Is this design actually useful, not just cool looking and interesting? Absolutely. Just a highly, highly recommendable knife. Something that every single time I carried it and used it, I was impressed in general by how well it performed. And it's just a knife that I bought and sold multiple times. I'm just always happy to have it in my collection. It's also a knife that I end up giving to a lot of people, other people in general, when they just sort of want a knife to do stuff with. That is the Spyderco Spydiechef. This has been Clark the Knife. Hope you found that helpful. And if you got any thoughts on the Spydiechef, feel free to drop them down in the comments. I will see you again soon.